What would you do if you had to judge a man who claimed to be the Son of God? This wasn't a hypothetical question for Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea. Historical sources from Philo, Josephus, and Tacitus reveal a complex man caught between political survival and an impossible decision. Before diving into this historically documented account, if you enjoy learning about real historical figures through primary sources, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these authentic historical stories together, based on actual ancient records and archaeological evidence. In 1961, Italian archaeologist Antonio Frova was excavating at Caesarea Maritima, the ancient Roman capital of Judea province, when his team made a discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of one of history's most controversial figures. Buried in the ruins of a Roman theater, they found a limestone inscription that had been reused as a step. The weathered Latin text, when carefully translated, read, Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Sude, Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea. This artifact, now known as the Pilate Stone, provided the first archaeological proof that Pontius Pilate was indeed a real historical figure, not merely a character from Christian tradition. The inscription dates to around 30 AD and confirms details that historians had debated for centuries. Most significantly, it establishes his correct title as praefectus, prefect, rather than procurator, as some later sources had claimed. This seemingly minor detail actually reveals important information about the nature of his authority and the administrative structure of Roman Judea. The discovery of the Pilate Stone transformed scholarly understanding of the historical context surrounding Jesus' trial. Prior to 1961, some historians questioned whether Pilate had ever existed, dismissing him as a literary creation. The archaeological evidence not only proved his existence, but also confirmed that he held exactly the position described in the Gospels during the precise time period when Jesus' crucifixion is said to have occurred. Our knowledge of Pontius Pilate comes from several independent historical sources, each providing different perspectives on his character and governance. These sources, written by authors with varying religious and political viewpoints, allow us to construct a more complete picture of the man behind one of history's most famous decisions. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher and contemporary of Pilate, provides perhaps the most scathing assessment. Writing around 40 AD in his Legatio ad Gaium, Philo describes Pilate's administration as characterized by his venality, his plundering, his habit of despoiling people, his cruelty, and his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned, and his ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty. This account is particularly significant because Philo was writing during Pilate's lifetime and had access to contemporary reports from Jewish communities in Palestine. His description suggests that Pilate's harsh rule and disregard for Jewish customs created ongoing tension throughout his decade-long administration. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote in the late 1st century, provides more detailed accounts of specific incidents during Pilate's rule. In his Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93 to 94 AD, Josephus describes several conflicts between Pilate and the Jewish population, including controversies over the use of temple funds for public works projects and Pilate's introduction of Roman military standards bearing imperial images into Jerusalem. Josephus's account is valuable because he had access to both Jewish and Roman sources, and his perspective as a former Jewish military commander who later worked for the Romans gives him insight into both sides of these conflicts. His writing suggests that Pilate consistently underestimated the religious sensitivities of his Jewish subjects, leading to repeated confrontations. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 116 AD in his Annals, mentions Pilate only briefly but provides crucial confirmation of the Christian accounts. He writes, "The name Christian comes from their founder, who was executed during the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate." This passage is particularly significant because Tacitus was generally hostile to Christianity and had no reason to corroborate Christian claims unless they were historically accurate. To understand Pilate's actions and motivations, we must first examine the complex political situation he inherited when he became prefect of Judea around 26 AD. The province presented unique challenges that distinguished it from other parts of the Roman Empire. Judea had been under direct Roman rule only since 6 AD, when the ethnarch Archaeological was deposed for incompetent governance. Prior to this, the region had been ruled by client kings, most notably Herod the Great, who had managed to maintain relative stability while accommodating both Roman political demands and Jewish religious sensitivities. The transition to direct Roman administration created immediate tensions. Unlike client kings who could claim some legitimacy in local eyes, Roman prefects were foreign occupiers with no connection to Jewish law or custom. They were expected to maintain order, collect taxes, and ensure loyalty to Rome, while governing a population whose religious beliefs often conflicted with Roman practices. The Jewish population's relationship with Rome was further complicated by their monotheistic beliefs, which made the imperial cult and emperor worship deeply problematic. This religious dimension created ongoing friction that didn't exist to the same degree in other Roman provinces, where local populations more easily accommodated Roman religious practices alongside their existing beliefs. Pilate's appointment came during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, who had instructed provincial governors to focus on stability and efficient tax collection rather than territorial expansion. This meant that Pilate's primary objectives were maintaining order and ensuring steady revenue flow to Rome, goals that sometimes conflicted with local religious sensibilities. The economic situation in Judea also created challenges. The province was not particularly wealthy by Roman standards, but its location made it strategically important for controlling trade routes and maintaining security on the eastern frontier of the empire. Pilate needed to balance the economic demands of Rome with the limited resources available in his province. One of our most detailed accounts of Pilate's governing style comes from Josephus's description of the military standards controversy, which occurred early in his administration and set the tone for his entire tenure. This incident reveals both Pilate's initial misunderstanding of Jewish religious sensibilities and his ultimate pragmatism when faced with determined resistance. According to Josephus, Pilate ordered Roman military units to bring their standards into Jerusalem under cover of darkness. These standards bore images of the emperor, which Jewish religious law considered idolatrous. Previous Roman administrators had respected this sensitivity and kept such images out of the Holy City, but Pilate apparently decided to assert Roman authority more directly. When Jerusalem residents discovered the presence of the standards, they traveled en masse to Caesarea Maritima, where Pilate had his headquarters, to demand their removal. The protesters surrounded Pilate's residence and maintained a continuous vigil for 5 days and nights, refusing to disperse despite threats and intimidation. On the 6th day, Pilate agreed to meet with the protesters in the city's stadium. According to Josephus's account, Pilate had secretly arranged for soldiers to surround the crowd, intending to intimidate them into submission. When he gave the signal for the soldiers to draw their swords, however, the Jewish protesters immediately threw themselves on the ground and exposed their necks, declaring they would rather die than see their law violated. Pilate's response to this display of religious commitment reveals important aspects of his character. Rather than ordering a massacre that would have created martyrs and potentially sparked a larger rebellion, he chose to withdraw the standards from Jerusalem. This decision suggests that despite his reputation for cruelty, Pilate was capable of pragmatic calculation when faced with the possibility of major unrest. The standards controversy established a pattern that would characterize Pilate's entire administration: initial confrontation over religious issues, followed by tactical withdrawal when faced with determined resistance. This pattern suggests that Pilate learned, albeit slowly, to navigate the complex religious landscape of his province. Another major incident that shaped contemporary perceptions of Pilate involved his decision to fund the construction of an aqueduct to improve Jerusalem's water supply. While the project itself served a legitimate public need, Pilate's method of financing it created a crisis that nearly led to his removal from office. According to multiple sources, including both Josephus and early Christian writers, Pilate decided to fund the aqueduct construction using money from the temple treasury, known as the Korban. From a Roman administrative perspective, this may have seemed logical. Using local religious funds for local infrastructure projects was not uncommon in other parts of the empire. However, this decision demonstrated Pilate's continuing failure to understand Jewish religious law and custom. The Korban was considered sacred money dedicated to God and governed by strict religious regulations about its use. Many Jews viewed Pilate's appropriation of these funds as not merely theft, but as sacrilege that defiled the temple itself. When news of Pilate's plan became public, it triggered massive protests in Jerusalem. Josephus describes crowds gathering in the city and demanding that Pilate abandon the project and restore the temple funds. The situation escalated when Pilate traveled from Caesarea to Jerusalem to address the unrest personally. According to Josephus's account, Pilate arranged for soldiers dressed as civilians to mingle with the crowd of protesters. When he gave a predetermined signal, these disguised soldiers attacked the demonstrators with clubs and swords. The assault was apparently indiscriminate, targeting not only active protesters, but also innocent bystanders who happened to be in the area. The casualty toll from this incident is disputed in ancient sources, but most accounts suggest that hundreds of people were killed or injured. The violence was severe enough to generate formal complaints to Rome and may have contributed to growing imperial concerns about Pilate's handling of his province. This incident reveals a more troubling aspect of Pilate's character than the standards controversy. While his handling of the standards crisis showed pragmatic flexibility, his response to the aqueduct protests demonstrated a willingness to use deceptive and disproportionate violence against civilian populations. The historical record provides several contemporary assessments of Pilate's character and administration from people who knew him personally or had direct knowledge of his governance. These accounts, while sometimes contradictory, offer valuable insights into how Pilate was perceived by his contemporaries. Philo of Alexandria's assessment, mentioned earlier, is particularly harsh, but carries significant weight because of his contemporary status and connections to the Jewish community in Palestine. Philo's description of Pilate as driven by venality and cruelty suggests that his reputation for harsh governance was well established among Jewish communities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Philo also mentions Pilate's habit of despoiling people, which likely refers to excessive taxation or confiscation of property. This accusation is consistent with other evidence suggesting that Pilate faced ongoing pressure from Rome to increase tax revenues from his relatively poor province. The reference to continual murders of people untried and uncondemned is particularly significant because it suggests that Pilate routinely executed people without proper legal proceedings. This practice would have been especially offensive to Jewish communities, who placed great emphasis on proper legal procedures and the rights of the accused. Josephus provides a more nuanced assessment, acknowledging Pilate's harsh methods while also recognizing some of his practical achievements. Josephus notes that despite the controversies, Pilate maintained relative stability in the province for nearly a decade, suggesting some level of administrative competence. Agrippa Virus, the Jewish king who eventually succeeded Pilate as ruler of portions of Palestine, reportedly complained to Emperor Caligula about Pilate's ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty. This complaint was part of the political maneuvering that ultimately led to Pilate's recall to Rome, but it suggests that criticism of his methods extended beyond ordinary Jewish subjects to include Jewish political elites. Roman sources are generally less critical of Pilate, though they provide limited information about his specific actions in Judea. The fact that he served for nearly 10 years suggests that his superiors in Rome considered him reasonably effective at maintaining order and collecting taxes, which were the primary measures of success for provincial governors. Pilate's downfall began with an incident involving the Samaritan community, which, like the Jewish population, had complex religious beliefs that sometimes conflicted with Roman administrative practices. This final controversy provides insight into how Pilate's methods ultimately proved counterproductive, even from a Roman perspective. According to Josephus, the incident began when a Samaritan religious leader claimed to know the location of sacred vessels that Moses had allegedly buried on Mount Gerizim, the holiest site in Samaritan religion. The leader promised to reveal these treasures to anyone who joined him in a pilgrimage to the mountain. Large numbers of Samaritans responded to this call, gathering at a village called Tarathaba at the base of Mount Gerizim. They came armed, apparently expecting either to defend themselves against bandits during the journey or to fight for control of the sacred site against competing claimants. Pilate interpreted this gathering as a potential rebellion and responded with characteristic force. He deployed both infantry and cavalry units to block the pilgrims' route up the mountain. When fighting broke out, Roman forces killed many of the Samaritans and captured others, including some of their leaders whom Pilate subsequently executed. From Pilate's perspective, this response may have seemed reasonable, preventing a large armed gathering from reaching a strategic mountain location was standard security practice. However, the Samaritan community viewed his actions as an unprovoked attack on peaceful religious pilgrims, and they believed sie komung patient. You his heidebitsasiep, and koroldet his art for night. The Samaritan leadership responded by sending a formal complaint to Vitellius, the Roman legate of Syria, who was Pilate's immediate superior. They argued that the gathering had been purely religious in nature, and that Pilate's violent response was unjustified and counterproductive. Vitellius conducted his own investigation and apparently concluded that the Samaritan complaints had merit. He ordered Pilate to travel to Rome to answer charges before Emperor Tiberius personally. This recall effectively ended Pilate's career as a provincial administrator and marked the beginning of his disappearance from historical records. The Samaritan incident is significant because it shows how Pilate's tendency toward violent solutions to complex problems ultimately undermined his effectiveness as an administrator. By failing to distinguish between genuine security threats and legitimate religious activities, he created unnecessary conflicts that damaged Roman interests in the region. When Jewish religious leaders brought Jesus before Pilate for judgment, they were operating within a complex legal framework that had evolved during the early decades of Roman rule in Judea. Understanding this framework is crucial for interpreting the historical accounts of the trial and Pilate's role in Jesus' execution. Under Roman law, Provincial governors like Pilate possessed what was called imperium, supreme authority within their provinces that included the power of life and death over all inhabitants except Roman citizens. This authority was theoretically absolute, but in practice, governors were expected to exercise it in ways that maintained stability and served Roman interests. The Jewish religious courts, centered around the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, retained authority over religious matters and minor civil disputes, but they could not impose capital punishment. This restriction meant that any death sentence required Roman approval and execution, creating the jurisdictional situation that brought Jesus before Pilate. According to the Gospel accounts, which are our primary sources for the trial, Jewish leaders presented Jesus to Pilate with charges that were carefully crafted to concern Roman rather than Jewish interests. While their primary complaint against Jesus involved religious claims about his identity, they presented the case to Pilate as a matter of sedition and political rebellion. The specific charges mentioned in the Gospel accounts include claims that Jesus opposed paying taxes to Caesar and that he called himself King of the Jews. These accusations were designed to present Jesus as a political threat to Roman authority, rather than simply a religious teacher who had offended Jewish sensibilities. Pilate's initial response, as recorded in the Gospels, suggests skepticism about these charges. The accounts describe him questioning Jesus directly and concluding that he posed no real political threat to Roman interests. This assessment is consistent with what we know about Pilate's pragmatic approach to governance. He was primarily concerned with maintaining order and would have been unlikely to execute someone unless they represented a genuine security risk. However, the Gospel accounts also describe increasing pressure from Jewish leaders and crowds demanding Jesus' execution. This pressure campaign appears to have been carefully orchestrated to exploit Pilate's political vulnerabilities and force his hand even when his initial judgment suggested that execution was unnecessary. The historical context suggests that Pilate found himself in a difficult position. His legal assessment indicated that Jesus was not guilty of crimes deserving death, but refusing to execute him risked creating the kind of public disorder that could damage his standing with his superiors in Rome. The decision to crucify Jesus must be understood within the broader context of Pilate's political situation and his previous experiences governing Judea. By the time of Jesus' trial, Pilate had already weathered several major controversies and was likely aware that his position was increasingly precarious. The Gospel account suggests that Pilate initially attempted to avoid making a decision by sending Jesus to Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee, since Jesus was technically from that jurisdiction. When Herod refused to take responsibility for the case and sent Jesus back, Pilate was forced to render judgment himself. Pilate's offer to release either Jesus or Barabbas, as described in the Gospels, appears to have been another attempt to avoid direct responsibility for Jesus' execution while still satisfying the demands of the crowd. The fact that the crowd chose Barabbas suggests that the situation had been orchestrated by Jesus' opponents to ensure his condemnation. From a Roman administrative perspective, Pilate's ultimate decision to order Jesus' crucifixion can be understood as a calculated political choice. Refusing to execute Jesus risked creating immediate civil unrest in Jerusalem, potentially during the Passover festival when the city was crowded with pilgrims from throughout the Jewish world. Such unrest could have had several negative consequences for Pilate's career. It might have required military intervention that could result in significant casualties, generating complaints to Rome about his inability to maintain order. It could have disrupted tax collection and commerce, reducing the economic benefits that Rome expected from the province. Most significantly for Pilate personally, major unrest in Judea might have prompted his recall to Rome to answer charges of incompetent governance. Given that he had already faced criticism for his handling of previous controversies, another major incident could have ended his career and possibly resulted in criminal charges against him. The crucifixion of Jesus therefore represented what Pilate likely saw as the least problematic option available to him. By acceding to the demands of Jewish leaders, he avoided immediate unrest while maintaining the appearance of decisive leadership. The execution of one individual, even if legally questionable, seemed preferable to the potential consequences of refusing. This calculation reveals the essentially political nature of Pilate's decision-making process. Rather than being primarily concerned with justice or legal precedent, he appears to have been focused on maintaining his own position and avoiding conflicts that could damage his standing with his Roman superiors. The crucifixion of Jesus had immediate and long-term consequences that extended far beyond what Pilate could have anticipated when he made his decision. In the short term, the execution appears to have achieved its intended purpose of maintaining order in Jerusalem and satisfying Jesus' opponents among the Jewish leadership. However, the emergence of Christianity as a significant religious movement transformed the historical significance of Pilate's decision in ways that would have been impossible to predict. Within a few decades of Jesus' death, Christian communities had spread throughout the Roman Empire, and Pilate's role in Jesus' execution became a central element of Christian theology and historical narrative. The early Christian interpretation of Pilate's actions was complex and evolved over time. The Gospel accounts generally portray him as reluctant to execute Jesus and ultimately yielding to pressure from Jewish leaders and crowds. This portrayal served several purposes for early Christian communities. It shifted primary responsibility for Jesus' death away from Roman authorities and onto Jewish leadership, and it presented Jesus' execution as the result of political expedience rather than legitimate criminal conviction. This interpretation had significant implications for early Christian relationships with Roman authorities. By portraying Pilate as recognizing Jesus' innocence, early Christian writers could argue that Christianity posed no legitimate threat to Roman order and that Jesus' execution had been a mistake rather than a justified response to sedition. The Roman response to early Christianity was initially limited, partly because the movement was small and partly because Roman authorities did not immediately recognize its potential significance. Pilate himself appears to have viewed Jesus' execution as a minor administrative matter that successfully resolved a local dispute. However, as Christianity grew and spread throughout the empire, Roman authorities began to view it as a more serious challenge to traditional religious and social structures. The Christian refusal to participate in imperial cult practices and their exclusive monotheism created conflicts similar to those that had characterized Jewish-Roman relations in Judea. Pilate's decision to execute Jesus also had consequences for Jewish-Christian relations that would persist for centuries. The early Christian emphasis on Jewish responsibility for Jesus' death, while serving immediate political purposes, contributed to the development of anti-Jewish sentiment within Christian communities that would have tragic consequences throughout subsequent history. After his recall to Rome around 36 AD, Pontius Pilate essentially disappears from reliable historical records. This disappearance has generated centuries of speculation and legend, but the actual facts of his final years remain largely unknown. The timing of Pilate's recall was significant because Emperor Tiberius died in March 37 AD, shortly after Pilate would have arrived in Rome to face charges related to the Samaritan incident. Tiberius's death and the succession of Caligula created political instability that may have affected Pilate's case. Some later Christian traditions claim that Pilate was exiled to Gaul or that he committed suicide, but these accounts are generally considered unreliable by modern historians. The lack of contemporary Roman records about Pilate's fate suggests that his case was not considered particularly significant by Roman authorities. The absence of reliable information about Pilate's later life stands in marked contrast to the extensive legendary material that developed around his figure in subsequent centuries. Various Christian and non Christian sources created elaborate stories about his conversion to Christianity, his punishment by God, or his continued persecution of Christians, but none of these accounts can be verified historically. This legendary development is itself historically significant because it demonstrates how Pilate's association with Jesus' crucifixion transformed his historical reputation. While contemporary sources remember him primarily as a harsh but typical Roman administrator, later tradition made him a central figure in Christian salvation history. The contrast between the historical Pilate and the legendary figure also illustrates how religious narratives can reshape historical memory. The man who appears in contemporary sources as a pragmatic Roman official concerned primarily with maintaining order and advancing his career became, in Christian tradition, a symbol of worldly power confronting divine truth. Modern archaeological and historical research continues to provide new insights into Pilate's administration and the context of his decision-making. Recent excavations at Caesarea Maritima and other sites in Palestine have revealed additional information about Roman administrative practices and the daily realities of provincial governance during this period. Modern historians generally view Pontius Pilate as a fairly typical Roman provincial administrator whose reputation was shaped primarily by his association with Jesus' crucifixion, rather than by any unique qualities of character or governance. This assessment is based on comparison with other Roman prefects and procurators of the same period, many of whom faced similar challenges and employed similar methods. Pilate's harsh treatment of provincial populations was not unusual by Roman standards. Provincial governors were expected to maintain order and collect taxes, and the use of force to achieve these objectives was considered normal and necessary. Contemporary accounts of other provincial administrators reveal similar patterns of conflict with local populations over religious and cultural issues. What distinguished Pilate's situation was the particular complexity of governing Judea, with its unique religious sensitivities and history of resistance to foreign rule. The province presented challenges that were less pronounced in other parts of the Roman Empire, requiring a level of cultural understanding and diplomatic skill that many Roman administrators lacked. Pilate's decade-long tenure suggests that his superiors in Rome considered him reasonably effective at achieving his primary objectives. The fact that he survived several major controversies and maintained his position for nearly 10 years indicates that his methods, while sometimes harsh, generally served Roman interests. The ultimate failure of his administration, as evidenced by his recall following the Samaritan incident, appears to have resulted from his inability to distinguish between genuine security threats and legitimate religious activities. This failure led to unnecessary conflicts that damaged Roman interests and generated complaints from local populations. From a purely administrative perspective, Pilate's career illustrates both the challenges and limitations of Roman provincial governance. The empire's success depended on its ability to maintain local stability while extracting resources and loyalty. But this required administrators who could navigate complex cultural and religious landscapes. Pilate's mixed record, maintaining general stability while generating repeated controversies, reflects the broader tensions inherent in Roman imperial administration. The empire's strength lay in its military power and administrative efficiency, But these advantages could not easily overcome deep-seated cultural and religious differences between rulers and ruled. The historical Pilate thus emerges as neither the reluctant judge of Christian tradition nor the brutal tyrant of some Jewish accounts, but as a complex figure whose actions reflected the constraints and opportunities of his particular historical moment. Understanding his decision to execute Jesus requires appreciation of these constraints and the political calculations that shaped his choices. Pontius Pilate's historical legacy has been shaped far more by his role in Christian narrative than by his actual accomplishments as a Roman administrator. This transformation illustrates how religious significance can overshadow historical context in shaping collective memory of past figures. In Christian tradition, Pilate became a symbol of worldly authority faced with divine truth, and his question, "What is truth?" became one of the most quoted phrases in Christian literature. The early Christian emphasis on his reluctance to execute Jesus established a tradition of viewing him as a tragic figure caught between conscience and political necessity. This interpretation served important theological purposes for early Christian communities, but it also created a historical legacy that emphasized Pilate's role as judge rather than his broader career as a provincial administrator. The complexity of his decade-long governance of Judea was reduced to a single dramatic moment that has defined his place in history. Medieval Christian tradition further developed the Pilate legend, creating elaborate stories about his origins, his psychological state during Jesus' trial, and his ultimate fate. These stories, while historically unreliable, demonstrate the continuing fascination with his character and the moral questions raised by his decision. The contrast between historical evidence and legendary development around Pilate's figure provides important insights into how religious narratives interact with historical memory. The man revealed by contemporary sources, a pragmatic Roman official concerned primarily with political survival, differs significantly from the conflicted judge of Christian tradition. Modern historical scholarship has attempted to recover the historical Pilate from centuries of legendary accretion, but this effort faces significant challenges. The limited nature of contemporary sources and the overwhelming influence of Christian narrative make it difficult to assess his character and motivations with complete confidence. Nevertheless, the archaeological evidence, particularly the Pilate Stone discovery, has confirmed the basic historical framework within which his administration operated. This evidence demonstrates that whatever legendary elements may have attached to his story, Pilate was indeed a real historical figure who held the position and exercised the authority described in early Christian accounts. The enduring fascination with Pilate's character reflects broader human interest in moral decision-making under pressure and the intersection of personal conscience with political necessity. His story raises questions that remain relevant. How do individuals maintain moral integrity while operating within systems that may demand ethically questionable actions? What responsibilities do those in authority bear for the consequences of their decisions? These questions ensure that Pontius Pilate remains a figure of continuing historical and moral interest, regardless of how much or how little we can know about his actual thoughts and motivations. The judge who condemned Jesus continues to challenge us to consider the relationship between power, justice, and individual responsibility in ways that transcend the specific historical context of first-century Palestine.